Like, I begged Fenway not to sanction the signing. I think Spurs are going to cancel the contract. This new guy has turned up. He just spent 3 hours ripping our data analysis apart. He spoke about Sadio Mane and said he regretted not signing Mane at Dortmund. Michael thought Coutinho was the best player in Inter, and it was an Inter side that had Wesley Sneijder and Samuel Eto'o in it. I thought, what if Jurgen comes in and we have exactly the same arguments as we had with Brendan? My name is Ian Graham. For 11 years, from 2012 to 23, I was Director of Research at Liverpool. My role at Liverpool was to collect, to analyse, to produce insights and recommendations from any data source that was connected to the football performance of the club.
You see, we're going to go for the sensationalist. Use the man that identified the signings that made Liverpool win the Premier League, which is exactly the title of the book that you have coming out next month, and the reason that we're here to speak today. But you're also an unofficial member of the transfer committee. We learned that in the book. It's quite interesting to read about the trials and tribulations of this sort of term that unfairly, I feel, got pushed around, especially in the media, and was somewhat lamented. We also learn in the book, and it's great to meet a fellow person who has somewhat of a hatred of draws in football. So that's great to hear. I've banged on about this for long beyond anybody's bored of hearing me talk about how draws are a terrible result. And I think that us as Liverpool supporters should know that better than anybody. At least 2 league titles have been lost because of too many draws. We'll dive into it. And obviously, your time at Liverpool, brought in by Fenway Sports Group, it was quite an interesting roller coaster of a beginning. And you describe it as a disastrous start under Brendan Rodgers. Tell us a little bit about that and like the difficulty in getting somebody like Brendan to become on board with the idea of data analytics, forming an opinion on who Liverpool should sign.
Yeah. So thanks for the kind comments about the book. Just to mention that the book title, How to Win the Premier League, is a little bit tongue in cheek. I hope I make it clear in the book that it wasn't only the data. The data doesn't make any difference at all unless you've got a great manager, a great sporting director, a great scouting department to go and do all of the other work that's absolutely necessary for success. So yeah, with that said, 2012, I think I turned up at Liverpool to be offered the job on the same day that Damien Comolli left. It was something of a surprise to be offered the job, and of course, Kenny Dalglish and Fenway decided to part company that season as well. I was I was locked into my notice period at my previous job, and because I was working for Spurs, there's a bit of a conflict of interest there. So I really couldn't start looking at stuff for Liverpool until my commitments to Spurs had ended. And then at the time, Liverpool didn't have the squads, didn't quite have the cachet that it's got today. So, the managers that were available for us to look at, it wasn't a very long list. It basically came down to Brendan or Roberto Martinez, who'd both done very good things with very limited budgets at Swansea and at Wigan. And so, yeah, Brendan was a stronger candidate there. But then from day one, it became clear that he wanted to be a manager in the old school British sense of being a manager, which was I'm the boss, I'm the only boss, I take all of the decisions, including all recruitment decisions. And that wasn't the model that Fenway believed that he was signing up to. But he set his stall out very clearly in those early weeks. And his transfer strategy in terms of like the positions that needed strengthening and the individual players that he thought would be vital to Liverpool's chances of success, they were just very different positions and very different players to what we thought was needed for the squad. And that first sum was difficult because of that, and those difficulties just continued. It was a kind of a PR problem more than anything that the transfer committee became a thing and got given a name because at lots of other clubs, transfers were decided in exactly the same way. You know, differences club to club, but typically the chairman, the CEO, head of recruitment, and manager sit down. You know, each of them's got a different say and a different amount of decision-making power at each club. But at nearly every club, even back in 2012, there was some sort of discussion and some sort of meeting happened rather than the manager saying, I want this player, and that's the end of the story, no negotiations. And really, that's where the difficulty came from. Brendan wanted the club to be organised with him just in sole charge of recruitment decisions, whereas I think it's fair to say Fenway didn't want that. If they did want it, there was no point in me or Michael Edwards being at the club.
Yeah, I think that whoever termed that phrase of the transfer committee certainly did you and Michael and all the other analytics guys any favors. It's interesting in the book, like we learn about the sort of friction between the signing of Joe Allen, even for instance, that was a player that you wouldn't have necessarily thought that would had the attributes that Liverpool required at the time, and then later on where Brendan wanted to sign Adam Lallana, but we already had number 10s and that sort of squad identification. Again, another one that I found super interesting was the whole part around Brendan had a deal basically to get Tom Ince from Blackpool.
Yeah,
Thankfully, Blackpool changed the terms of the agreement, and therefore you got to sign one of your favourite Liverpool players. I think it's worth pointing out as well that you are a Liverpool supporter, and this was like your dream job. Um, but yeah, the Liverpool, because of the Tom Ince deal not going ahead, tell us about your favourite little man.
I think in terms of um, Tom Ince and Coutinho in that January 2013 window. It really is an example of even with a club that's trying to put a good process in place for identifying and signing players, and even in later years when we did have a really good process in place for that, how much luck plays a part in it. Things happened that might not have happened, and that includes Coutinho arriving at Liverpool. And in the, things in the other direction as well, players we could have and should have signed but didn't for similarly strange reasons. Um, so with Coutinho, we really struggled for goals in that start of that 12-13 season, and part of the reason for that was Craig Bellamy, Maxi Rodriguez, Dirk Kuyt were all leaving. Brendan didn't really um, want to persuade them to stay. I don't know if it was realistic that any of them would have extended their contracts anyway. And so our opinion was we don't have any strikers. We've got Suarez, but he can't do it all on his own. He needs some help. But Brendan's priority, for whatever reason, was for midfielders, of which we already had a few decent ones at the club. Um, but that first half of the season, we really struggled for goals. Barini was the player who came in, got injured in the September, I think it was. And so by December, Brendan was on board with the idea that we need to add goals, we need to add forwards. Unfortunately, Tom Ince is a great player, but he wasn't a player that would improve Liverpool in any way. Um, but the manager had the manager's got to agree to the player coming to the club. The worst thing a club can do is to sign a player that the manager's not convinced by, because it is fundamentally the manager's decision to which players are going to start, what formation he's going to use, which roles in that formation he thinks these players are suitable for. So it's absolutely vital to get the manager on board. And Ince was Brendan's number one target. Wouldn't be particularly expensive, so fine, it was going to happen. And then for whatever reason, Blackpool, sorry, changed the terms of the deal. and we're left scrabbling for another attacking player. Coutinho had put in a brilliant half season at Espanyol under Pochettino. He hadn't looked that great at Inter, and he just wasn't getting the minutes at Inter. He had a few injury problems as well. Weirdly, Spurs had played against Inter when both me and Michael were working at Spurs, and Michael thought Coutinho was the best player in Inter, and it was an Inter side that had Wesley Sneijder and Samuel Eto'o in it. So, that's quite good for a 20-year-old small Brazilian guy to be compared favorably to those superstars. Um, and and yeah, so his data looked good. It was a low number of minutes. So with data analysis, we like to see the more evidence we've got about players, the better. So the more minutes, the better. So it was a case of this player looks really good. It's kind of not quite enough minutes to say he's guaranteed to make a difference to Liverpool, and that's where scouting comes in. So our scouting team was also heavily in favour of signing Coutinho. Um, Serie A was Barry Hunter's speciality. He loves a Brazilian playmaker as much as I do, and as much as Brendan does. So it was one of these rare occasions where um, scouting loved the player, data was positive on the player, and when you show Brendan, a very skillful Brazilian number 10, that's the sort of player Brendan loves as well. So it really showed what could happen if we're all on the same page, if we're all, engaged in a process of trying to find the best players that we all agree are the best players for the club. It was just a shame that it had to be a fallback option to sign in a championship winger.
It's interesting because I think that, well, for starters, Philippe Coutinho probably epitomizes your whole tenure at Liverpool. You identify a player who was undervalued. It worked with the scouting side, and then obviously when he is sold, it allows Liverpool to go on and sign Alisson and Fabinho and Van Dijk and really transform the team into the title winning team that it was. Um, you speak there about the lack of goals within the squad, and obviously eventually we get our hands on Daniel Sturridge, and then towards the back end of Brendan's time, I found it interesting your analysis around Christian Benteke and how you sort of you say that you practically begged Liverpool not to sign him, and that Brendan was so insistent upon him, and it's interesting with the biases that managers get, and obviously in the book we hear extensively about home bias and all the other biases in and around football itself. But when you look at that and you're profiling a player as well, explain a little bit about how you actually profile a player. So somebody like Benteke is not the same as Luis Suarez. We all know that, but how does that in your role with the data?
Yeah, so in the book I talk a lot about style. We also call it player role or player classification. So we're trying to understand who the player is. There's kind of two components to a player, and we try to keep them as separate questions to answer about the player. So the first question and the most important question is he a good player? Is he going to increase Liverpool's chances of winning a particular game, either through, creating chances for strikers, being a striker himself, or stopping goals from being conceded on the defensive side? And then alongside that, we ask, what formation do we play? And more importantly, how do we interpret that formation? So 4-4-2 can look very different under different managers. And Benteke was um, he was the epitome um, of that kind of misunderstanding of style, if you like. So Benteke is a very good player. So whenever I say a player doesn't work out or a player wasn't good enough, I don't mean to say anything negative about the player. Any player playing in the Premier League is a great player compared to most of the other players in the world. And Benteke in the right system, in a system that plays to his strengths, is a very effective striker. Our problem was Liverpool didn't play that system, had not played that system. And in 2012, when both Brendan and I joined the club, Brendan's number one priority was to get rid of Andy Carroll, the one player that we'd had in the past who did play in that style. The strange thing is at Swansea, Brendan had a striker called Danny Graham who did kind of play in that style and was effective for Brendan at Swansea. But it really was the case. So Benteke's style comes out. He almost is the stereotype of a target man striker. He thrives in the box. He thrives in the air. Having wingers to deliver crosses to him that's what you want. That's how you want to play if Benteke's in your team, and that's just not how Liverpool played. Especially in 13-14, we played counter attack. We played fast on the floor football, which was the type of football that brought Brendan to Liverpool in the first place. You know, Fenway's seen him, what he did at Swansea, playing very attractive football with maybe slightly less talented players than were available at Liverpool. And so it was very strange to say, you know, this style is what Liverpool wanted you for. You're going to shift away from that style if we get Benteke. And there was a theory that, you know, coming to a bigger club that plays better football or plays with the ball on the floor rather than in the air, that Benteke would change his style. And one of the strengths of data analysis is you can go back in history and say, well, you can try and answer a question by saying, well, have we seen this before? Does this typically happen, or is it unusual for this to happen? So I went back and looked at, you know, many seasons of transfers to see, well, first of all, do big clubs buy target men in the first place? And they don't. And second of all, when target men move to a different club, do they change their style? And they don't. That's not to say it would be impossible for Benteke to change his style, but there was no evidence that target men typically changed their style when they moved teams. And to be fair to Benteke, if you look at his goal rate for Liverpool, it was pretty good. I think it was his second best season in terms of raw goal rate, but he just didn't start that many games because I don't know if it became clear to Brendan or not, but he stopped starting just before Brendan left the club. So yeah, all of our work was about mitigating risk to have as much evidence as possible to say this transfer is going to work for us, because that's where most clubs go wrong, is transferring in players that aren't going to work for them in one way or another. And it was frustrating with Benteke because the style, again, nothing negative to say about the player or the person, just the style he played. There wasn't a role for him or there wasn't a fit for him at Liverpool. So my preference of Romelu Lukaku, who had a lot of the strengths of Benteke, but a lot more mobile, less of a traditional target man, can also play in behind and front to goal as well. Yeah, Brendan was convinced that Benteke was just a superior player to Lukaku. And playing against Liverpool, he was. He played a blinder every time he played against Liverpool. And from Brendan's point of view, I can see, you know, he plays against us once and scores. Okay, I know he's a danger. We're going to spend all week planning how we're going to stop Benteke, and he scores against us. And then in the third game, he scores against us. And the fourth game, I can see, I can see why he looked like a unstoppable player. He was unstoppable against Liverpool. Unfortunately, he wasn't as unstoppable against other teams. And the way Liverpool play is very different to the way Aston Villa played.
So cards on the table. You were involved in the process. We hear quite a lot actually about the sort of identification of Jurgen Klopp and your advice to Fenway regarding especially around Jurgen's final season at Dortmund, which is super interesting, and the story about how you first won Jurgen over with the sort of analysis of the defeats really under his last season. But so cards on the table, what was your personal feeling when you found out from Fenway that Brendan would be leaving and that they'd like your help in identifying a new manager?
I don't like to see anyone get the sack. but the process just wasn't working at Liverpool. And so it was a chance to see, was the process going to work. It meant the pressure was on. The fact that Fenway had decided to keep the rest of the transfer committee on the books and make the change in the manager role, that means the pressure is really on because Fenway are giving us their vote of confidence, if you like. But then that pressure becomes a lot less when Jurgen Klopp's available to bring on as a manager. So yeah, it was exciting because it was a chance to see if we were right. So we believed in this process that we had of identifying players, and it had just gone wrong for operational reasons. It was just a difference of opinion between us and the manager, which is understandable, but it's not going to cause a lot of good decisions to be made. So really excited to test, is the process going to work? At the same time, um, I was a little bit nervous because I thought, what if Jurgen comes in and we have exactly the same arguments as we had with Brendan? We didn't know the man. We only knew him secondhand. So that was my fear. And luckily enough, thought that fear wasn't realised. Jurgen turned out, as you know, to be a super manager, but a super manager with the backroom staff as well as on the pitch.
Do you know then, did Fenway make it clear to Jurgen during the interview process that, the data analysis would be playing a role in the identification of players to bring to the club?
Yes, so they explained the process, and Jurgen. So data analysis wasn't really used in Germany at the time that Jurgen managed in Dortmund, but the, the main place that we used the data analysis was in recruitment, and so from Jurgen's point of view, it was just advertised as a efficient way of identifying players. He was promised he could have the final say on which players arrived, which players left, which is all he wanted. And the other important difference is that in Germany, there is a culture of the sporting director or the director of football. In Germany, it's a much more explicit structure of the manager's not a manager, he's a head coach who reports to the sporting director. And the sporting director has to do press conferences and things. So, it really is as high profile a job as the head coach. But from Jurgen's point of view, it was kind of a non-issue because it's like, well, this is what it was like in Germany. Of course, why wouldn't the club be organized like this? And when we came to work with him in reality, that was his feeling. It was perfectly natural that there's a recruitment process in place. As long as he could have input and have the final decision on players, he was happy to trust our expertise.
So what was Jurgen like, in your interactions with him? And the thing that I'm really keen for is how much was there like in terms of meetings with Jurgen? So say the summer transfer window is coming up, were you involved in meetings like with him, or would that be left to such as Michael Edwards to speak to Jurgen and I like kind of sort of deliver that message?
Yes, I had very few meetings directly with Jurgen. Jurgen's a very smart guy. He's got an intuitive understanding of the sort of work that we do, but he's not particularly fascinated by statistics. And if you wanted to sort of present a player to him, we tried a couple of times showing him the statistics of players, and it just didn't excite him or cause him to be enthusiastic in any way whatsoever. So the way my department worked was as a service provider, if you like, to other departments. So our insights and our recommendations would go through the scouting department and through Michael Edwards in terms of recruitment, through the video analysis team in terms of post-match analysis or opposition analysis, and through the medical department for sports science issues and so on. So it was known that we were in the background working away, but it was just a element of expertise that all of the sports staff could call on. So I think most of the meetings I had with Jurgen, which was only a few, probably in the book, and they were rarely about transfer decisions. I think some of the funny um, like informal meetings where he spoke about Sadio Mane and said he regretted not signing at Dortmund, and said, "What about Matip? He's available on a free transfer." They were sort of casual conversations rather than meetings. That recruitment process, manager of Liverpool, manager of any football club, is a very stressful and time-consuming process. Jurgen's got better things to do than look at my statistical analysis. So he'd get involved heavily on the recruitment side when we went down to a short list, and those shortlisted players had already gone through the data process. And how that was presented to Jurgen would be more like a discussion with Michael as they were watching videos of the player to say, see how many shots Mo's getting from wide. That's much more productive than your typical wide forward would be. That would all be informed by the data, but it comes through as the story and the video analysis of the player, rather than Jurgen saying, I see Mo is number one in Italy for expected goals. That wasn't how it worked.
It's interesting the story I think about Mo and how Jurgen himself has said it, explained about how the data guys kind of persuaded him to sign, and he sort of preferred to have maybe Julian Brand come in. That's a real success story for you guys. It must make you feel very proud of your work that somebody has then gone on to to be the player that Mo Salah has. Um, I think the one that football fans always get very interested in is more the ones you mentioned it just back then, the ones that got away. So is there any that you can tell us about players that you felt that like we should have signed and then we didn't, or we, maybe made a decision over?
Yeah, there's two that immediately spring to mind. One from um, Tottenham Hotspur days. There was we recommended Mesut Ozil for Spurs before he went to Real Madrid. I think they were just a little bit too late. I think Madrid were already interested. It was ahead of the 2010 World Cup where he played brilliantly. But the Liverpool one, and again it plays into the Benteke story. So Benteke arrived in 2015, and the when I say in the book, like I begged Fenway not to sanction the signing. One of the reasons I was surprised that they were considering it was in summer 2014, Brendan wanted Benteke to come to Liverpool, and then we sort of convinced Fenway that he shouldn't come to Liverpool. And in 2013, it was the same thing. So the Benteke saga had been going on for 3 years by the time he actually arrived. And in that summer 2013, there was a chance. I think we were all younger and maybe a little bit more naive than we are today. So was it a really good chance? Could we have actually brought him to Liverpool um, if everyone had agreed? I don't know, but I think there was a realistic chance of signing Diego Costa from Atletico Madrid in 2013. He was talk about style. He was a player that I loved for his style because he could play wide forward or centre forward, which he did really well for Atletico. I think everyone loved Falcao at the time. Costa was my favourite at Atletico, and yeah, Benteke was the number one target. And by the time we decided, okay, let's go for Costa, it was too late. He'd already signed a new contract. And thinking back, can you imagine a forward line of Luis Suarez and Diego Costa? I'm not sure Liverpool would be anyone's second team with that pair of centre forwards.
Yeah, that would have been a referee's nightmare, but as supporters, we would have absolutely loved it, and it would have been chaos for defenders. Yeah, I do seem to remember that there was a report somewhere around the time, maybe it was in the January window, that we'd allegedly tried to match Costa's release fee or whatever it was, and then, in
Mm.
fact, like you say, he'd already signed a new contract, unfortunately for us. So one that definitely is one that got away, and I don't know whether you're allowed to tell us any more about this, but Nabil Fekir. Can you say what happened there? And his numbers, it seemed like to us as supporters, were fantastic.
Yeah, everyone's interested in Nabil Fekir. It's like I'm thinking that's a name I haven't heard in a long time. But I think he's is he still playing for Betis? Did he
Mhm.
play in the friendly against
They do.
us? Yeah, he's a great player. So for for many years before there was an opportunity, a slot in the squad for him. He spent an awful lot of time worrying about squad management, making sure that if we're signing players that they're actually going to play, they're not going to just stay on the bench. And if Coutinho is starting on left wide forward or left midfield, and you don't really play with a 10 or Firmino's playing there. There's no real space for a player like Fekir in the squad, but he looked great in the data for a couple of years. And we always maintained lists of players in different positions, even if we weren't actively looking to replace, because who knows when Barcelona at the time are going to come in with a stupid bid for a player. And so yeah, Fekir was definitely a player we were interested in. With Coutinho leaving, there was, in principle, a slot in the squad for him. I can't remember the details of what actually happened. I think it is the case that various players have had some injury issues that sort of prevented us from signing them. In Fakir's case, I can't remember the exact details. At the same time, there was a conversation going on about rebalancing the squads because we had one of the best attacks in Europe. Defense was good, but it wasn't one of the best defenses in Europe. And when Coutinho left in that January, the attack didn't really suffer from it. We didn't actually play that many games with uh, Mane, Firmino, Salah, and Coutinho. Um, but after Coutinho left, we kept on playing really well in attack, and that opened up the possibility of centre back was one of the weaker positions in the squad. So yeah, I loved Fekir as a player, and if Jurgen's desire was we need a number 10 like Coutinho, he would have been near the top of my list. To be honest, the squad had evolved away from that style anyway. So Jurgen's first season, he played 4-2-3-1, Tino number 10 or Lallana number 10. But he'd already been playing that 4-3-3 formation where you already have to squint a little bit to see where a true number 10 fits into that system.
Yeah, I do distinctly remember that when obviously the club pursued the Fekir, it was kind of like, oh, Jurgen going to move to having a number 10 again and going back to 4-2-3-1. But alas, it didn't happen and he stuck with 4-3-3. Just bringing it then more to,
What do you mean, alas? I think it was a pretty good 4-3-3.
well, that it worked out very well, right? Um, bringing it to the sort of the modern era, shall we say, and maybe sort of post Jurgen. You were involved in the process of identifying Jurgen. What would it have been that like stood out for the club when they went through this process in the last 6 months and then they ended up with Arne Slot? What do you feel that they would have been looking at and how they, in your numbers with your company now, what is it that Arne Slot is making Liverpool tick that many boxes?
So I'm in the privileged position of being a Liverpool fan these days. So I can only speak about Arne from a fan's point of view. I'm excited by the signing. He did really good things with probably lesser known players at Feyenoord. So yeah, the signs are good at Liverpool, but I say that only as a fan, not as an analyst. So I can certainly talk about what factors made Klopp a really interesting manager prospect for Liverpool, and I dare say the same sort of analysis would have come into play with Slot. And with the increased amount of data available, especially tracking data that can tell you a lot more about the style and the formation that a team plays in, a high line, our manager's good at getting a tune out of defenders if they have to play a high line versus a low block. I'm sure that would have played a role, but again, I'm on the outside looking in these days, so your guess is as good as mine. From Jurgen's perspective, the performance of the manager, the performance of the team at Dortmund was really good. Um, but I talk a lot in the book about the involvement of luck in football versus, performance is not always the same as outcome. Teams can have a few lucky wins, teams can have a few unlucky losses. From a performance point of view, the first thing was to discount that terrible 14-15 season because their performances had been almost as good as previous seasons. It's just the ball wasn't ending up in the net. So, from a very basic expected goals analysis, Dortmund were many points worse off than they should have been had those chances, those good quality and high quantity of chances um, been turned into goals at anything like a normal rate. So we still rated them as the second best team in Germany at the end of that 14-15 season. And then next season, they finished second quite easily. And it's not because Jurgen had left and he was the problem, and now they've rebounded. They just sort of reverted to a typical performance after a very unlucky performance. So the first thing was, don't worry about this one bad season. We went further back in time as well, back to his Mainz days in the second division as a manager, and he'd consistently outperformed pre-season expectations. He'd consistently outperformed what the bookmakers were saying that how Mainz and Dortmund would do in the leagues. So you can't describe that overperformance to managers, but it's a little hint that okay, these teams seem to be doing better than we would otherwise expect, or that we'd expect on average. I think it was something like 4 out of 10 seasons he'd got a 90th percentile performance, and in 10 seasons you expect one 90th percentile performance. Um, and then allied to that is like the squads that he had at his disposal. If you've got Real Madrid squads, well, of course you have to win the league. That is what the expectation is. Dortmund had a squad. I think the average age was 22.7 when they won the Bundesliga for the first time, and then I think they got even younger and won the Bundesliga for a second time. And that was exactly the model that Liverpool wanted. We'd we had a strategy of signing young players so that they improve at Liverpool, and then we get the peak years of their performance, or we can realise a transfer fee when they leave the club. And it was a similar situation to what Jurgen had experienced at Dortmund. And so I'm sure all of those factors will have been looked at when it comes to slots. But yeah, you'd have to ask someone who works for the club to get the actual answer there.
So I guess that's a good point to maybe ask then what the reasons around yourself leaving the club, and it was at a time when obviously Michael Edwards had left as well, and eventually Julian Ward, and there was kind of, I think there was a concern that Liverpool might have been moving away from the data driven sort of analysis, or at least you know maybe there was tension between the data analysis and Jurgen maybe wanting to push his players more.
Yeah, I think I can only speak for myself there, obviously, rather than anyone else's reasons for leaving. But the, the most important thing was I'd been at the club for 11 years. I don't know if you've ever stayed in the same job for 11 years, but even if it's a job as good as the one I had, you know, a change was needed, let's say. I think I'd achieved what I wanted to achieve at Liverpool. We'd kind of shown that you could do data analysis and get better results, which was what my motivation was, especially after those missteps in the early days. Um, I think also I'd hired like a really talented team, and there was kind of no career progression for anyone. No one wants to leave Liverpool if you're working for Liverpool, but it's a small team, and I was in charge of that team. So for the rest of the team, it was a good opportunity. Will Spearman, who I hired back in 2018, I think it was, he's now got my old role there, and everyone else has changed their roles a little bit as well. So yeah, that that responsibility and that treadmill of 2 games a week, 2 transfer windows per season, it's got a lifespan on it. And I think I can't speak for Michael, but he'd he wanted to get off the treadmill earlier than I did. His job was a lot more stressful than mine. I didn't have to talk to agents, for example. And I was surprised when he said he needed to get off the treadmill, and then a year later, things were changing at the club as well, with all of those senior leadership changes. But it was just time for a change, for me personally as well.
So I've got to ask there then that, Michael has now returned. Okay, yeah, not necessarily per se just working for Liverpool, but obviously for Fenway. And they brought back Julian Ward also for Fenway, Hans Littard, the goalkeeper advisor. Did they ask you to come back and at any point?
Um, I had some informal discussions, but I think after being so close to the uh, club and so involved in that day-to-day business, I really wanted to do something else. And so my new business, which is a analytics consultancy, um, it's the kind of the best of both worlds is we work very closely with clubs, give them good advice about recruitment and how to use data in football. But I'm not on the hook for getting a signing over the line, or if the team plays badly for 3 games in a row, we can give some unbiased statistical advice, which is usually don't worry, teams go through bad patches. But I don't feel the pressure as clearly myself. I hopefully help other teams to deal with the pressure. So I was approached by a couple of Premier League clubs with, you know, can you repeat the trick for us? Can you do what you did for Liverpool? And I just wasn't interested in doing the same again, just with a club that I cared less about than Liverpool. So this was really an opportunity to do something different. And we work with clubs, many different countries and levels of competition as well. So it's a real eye opener after being in the Premier League for a number of years. It's a privilege to work for a club as big as Liverpool, but then the difficulty of it is you've got to fight against the biggest clubs on the planet to get success. But to see the challenges that clubs elsewhere in the pyramids or in different countries have got, it's been a really interesting process.
Yeah, I can imagine that for sure. So, I mean, we're obviously looking from a Liverpool point of view. Um, the last 2 summers have been dominated by Liverpool's pursuit of trying to sign a number 6, a holding midfielder, whatever we want to stylistically template them as, a Fabinho replacement, though. Obviously, last summer there was the whole ginormous bid for Moise Caicedo. I'm sure that's a player that you've got lots of data on. Um, is there anybody out there that your data now would identify? Because we hear that like the defensive midfield market is maybe a difficult one, and there's not a great deal of options. And obviously Liverpool would be looking at somebody below the age of 25. Is there anybody out there that if you were in your role that you would now be recommending to Anna or Richard Hughes now?
Yes, and clubs pay me money for that information.
So, take somebody like Adam Wharton, right, at Crystal Palace. Would Because we hear about obviously Liverpool want a certain amount of minutes that they've played. Would that be like something that would deter them from pursuing him because he's only played in the Premier League for half of the season?
I can't speak about that particular case. I'm a fan these days. I'm on the outsides looking in. But the general point about experience versus potential is a really interesting point, and that's something we spent a lot of time on at Liverpool. So the better the quality of the data, the fewer number of minutes you need to see. So if you've got tracking data, you can say something about the player's off-ball positioning. Is he available to receive passes? Is he covering in a defensive shape, and so on. Um, but we still like to see as many minutes as possible. So my rule of thumb, I was comfortable with a player that we signed where we saw about 2,000 minutes of data. And that that's different for different positions. If you've got a forward where the important things they do are well measured by the data, you can be comfortable with fewer minutes. Well, I talk in the book about, how many minutes is enough minutes. I recommended Giovanni Dos Santos to Spurs, who then went on and signed Giovanni Dos Santos based on 1,500 minutes, I think it was. And they were a super 1,500 minutes for Barcelona, but it didn't work out for him at Spurs for reasons other than his footballing ability, I would say. But still, that kind of demonstrates it's a good example of, you know, players can have a good 1,500 minutes or a bad 1,500 minutes. For centre backs, where more of their game is off the ball, more of it depends on the defensive structure of the team, then more minutes is prefer even more minutes than forward players is preferable to see. Um, and in terms of, you know, um, how many minutes makes me comfortable, yeah, about 2,000 depending on position, depending on age as well. So, a good, yeah, a player for whatever reason that we don't have data on and turns up in France at age 24, if he's had a good 2,000 minutes, that's very different to a 18-year-old having 2,000 good minutes because we don't just look at performance today. We look at what's this player going to bring us over the next 5 years. The 24 or 25-year-old, you're probably looking at, that's going to be his maximum performance over the next 4 or 5 years. He's only going to get slightly better if he gets better at all. Whereas an 18-year-old, um, typically they tend to get better and improve. So we try to estimate those things as well. I'm sure those conversations are happening at Liverpool. I don't have any insight into them, I'm afraid.
You must still be friends with Michael Edwards and giving him a call. But on Michael, you describe him in the book. I think the quote is that he can sometimes be quite combative and aggressive, and maybe that's his style. I was really interested to hear that he was more the guy that watched the tapes, he watched the video.
Mm.
So the marriage of the data alongside his actual visual was really the beauty of the relationship, right? So, is there anything else that you can tell us about Michael and his new role, how you feel that'll work out?
Yeah, Michael had a sort of unique background that, for through just luck, I suppose, it just meant that we worked quite well together. So he'd come up through football. He was a youth footballer, I think, at Peterborough's academy. Um, and then after leaving the game, went and got a informatics degree. So, he knew about technology, he knew a little bit about data. Um, Went back to football working for Prozone, which was football's first data company. But really, he understood because he'd grown up in that football culture. He understood that the statistics that were being collected didn't really mean anything. And so he was really anti-data the first time that I met him because it had been part of his role to give the coaching staff at Portsmouth, where he worked for Harry Redknapp, give them a list of, duels won and pass completion percentages. And he kind of intuitively knew it didn't really make any sense. The coaches wouldn't understand it. And even if they did understand it, they'd realize it didn't mean anything for the game. The numbers he was seeing wasn't how the game worked in his view. And he was right about that. And so at Prozone, he kind of turned his role. So Prozone collected video from many cameras around the stadium in order to collect this data. And he kind of realized that video was more valuable than the data that was collected off the back of it. So he turned that Prozone role into more of a video analysis role, and that really did speak to the coaches. They really loved the video analysis side of things. So that first meeting with Michael, um, yeah, he is combative, and I thought, I remember after the meeting calling up my boss at Decision Technology saying, I think Spurs are going to cancel the contract. This new guy has turned up. He just spent 3 hours ripping ripping our data analysis apart. So I don't think they're going to be interested in it anymore. But he was, I think, he was coming from the position of what I've seen about data in football, I just don't believe. And I think even in that first meeting, it was like, well, hang on a second, you're right. I don't believe in that form of data analysis of just counting passes. I agree, it doesn't mean anything for the game. So to slowly sort of introduce our concept of the game, and after some like translation difficulties between football language and data language, we realized we kind of saw the game in the same way. And because Michael had that mix of the football background, plus he's a smart guy, so just understood our approach and the sort of numbers we were coming up with, possession value, goal probability that's added by players, and so on. Um, he intuitively understood it, so he took our numbers as like a benchmark, the first cut of is this player any good or not? He would use the data and came to trust it as this is the first way through which we'll filter players. But then the data doesn't see everything. Taking formation and style into account is hard. It doesn't see our touches first pass or not. You can see that stuff these days, but back in 2009, you couldn't see that stuff. And so he'd sort of take our ratings as like the first place to say, okay, the data says he's a good player. Now let's have a look at him. I'm going to upgrade or downgrade my opinion on that player based on the extra stuff I can see in the video. And yeah, from that point on, he was happy to fund the data project because he could intuitively see when we got tracking data. It's like, great, I can see something about the off-ball behavior. This is where your model is the weakest. So yeah, we do need to invest in it. So yeah, those early arguments, um, even though his style is aggressive, the arguments were coming from the right place, which is he wanted to make sure he was doing a good job. He wanted to make sure he understood everything, that we weren't just reporting number of passes completed.
Ian, I know that your time is precious. I really do appreciate your speaking with us though and the insight that you have. And thank you for the book. Obviously, it's available now on hardback and audio. So I would recommend that to anybody that's watching and listening. Certainly get out there and read more, not just about Liverpool, but the data that's impacting football and its future. Thank you for your time, and we will continue to share a hatred of draws, and let's hope that every game is either won or lost.
Yeah, here's to more 4-3s.